Maria's journey opening. Maria Santos stood at the edge of the mountain trail, her worn hiking boots firmly planted on the rocky ground. The morning mist clung to the peaks around her like a soft blanket, and the air was so thin it made every breath feel precious. At 28 years old, she had already climbed more mountains than most people could count, but today felt different. Today, she was going to attempt something that everyone said was impossible. The local guide, Roberto, shook his head as he watched her adjust her backpack straps. He was a weathered man in his 50s who had been leading climbers through these Andean peaks for over 30 years. His face was deeply lined from decades of sun and wind, and his eyes held the wisdom that only comes from surviving countless dangerous situations in the mountains. "Listen," Roberto said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "I've seen many climbers come through here, strong men, professional athletes, people with expensive equipment and years of training. None of them have ever reached 3,800 meters on this particular route. The altitude gets to everyone. The weather changes without warning. The rocks are unstable, and there are sections where one wrong step means a fall of hundreds of feet." Maria looked up at the towering peak that stretched impossibly high above them. The summit was hidden in clouds, making it seem even more mysterious and challenging. She could feel her heart beating faster, but it wasn't from fear. It was from excitement and determination. "But Roberto," she replied, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach, "has anyone like me ever tried?" Roberto paused, considering her question. It was true that most of the climbers he guided were men, usually wealthy tourists or serious mountaineers with expensive gear and support teams. Maria was different. She had grown up in a small village at the base of these mountains. As a child, she had spent countless hours exploring the lower slopes, learning every trail and understanding how the weather patterns worked in these peaks. Her father had been a sheep herder who taught her to read the signs in the clouds and the way the wind moved through the valleys. Her mother had shown her which plants could be used for medicine and how to find water even in the driest conditions. This wasn't just a mountain to Maria. It was her backyard, her home, her heritage. The journey to this moment had been long and difficult. Maria had always felt drawn to the mountains, but in her village, climbing was seen as something for crazy foreigners with too much money and too little sense. Women, especially, were expected to stay close to home, help with the family business, and eventually marry and have children. But Maria had different dreams. As a teenager, she would sneak away from her chores to practice climbing on the smaller cliffs near her village. She taught herself to tie knots, to find handholds, and to move efficiently over rock. When she turned 18, she got a job at a local climbing shop in the nearest town, where she met other climbers and learned about proper equipment and techniques. The shop owner, Carlos, became like a mentor to her. He was an ex-professional climber who had competed internationally before a knee injury ended his career. He saw something special in Maria's natural ability and her deep connection to the mountains. Under his guidance, she learned advanced climbing techniques, mountain safety, and how to read topographical maps. Carlos also taught her about the history of mountaineering in the region. He told her stories of famous climbers who had attempted various peaks, both successful and failed expeditions, and the legends of ancient peoples who had considered these mountains sacred. The more Maria learned, the more she felt called to attempt something significant herself. The specific peak she was now preparing to climb had a reputation among local guides and climbers. At 3,800 meters, it wasn't the highest in the region, but it was considered one of the most technically challenging. The route required a combination of rock climbing, scrambling over loose scree, and navigating through sections where the weather could change from sunny and calm to violent storms in a matter of minutes. Several climbing expeditions had attempted this route over the years. A German team had tried 3 years ago and turned back at 3,200 meters when one of their members developed severe altitude sickness. An American solo climber had made it to 3,600 meters before loose rock gave way beneath him, causing a minor avalanche that forced him to retreat. Even a well-funded expedition from Japan, with the latest high-altitude gear and a support team, had been turned back by sudden storms at 3,700 meters. The mountains seemed to have a way of testing everyone who approached it, finding their weakness and exploiting it. Some people said the mountain was cursed, that the ancient spirits who lived there didn't want to be disturbed. Others claimed it was simply too dangerous, that the combination of technical difficulty, unpredictable weather, and extreme altitude made success nearly impossible. Roberto had been the guide for several of these failed attempts. Each time he had warned the climbers about the challenges they would face, but few had listened. They were usually confident in their abilities and equipment, dismissive of local knowledge and warnings, and each time the mountain had proven him right. But as Roberto looked at Maria, he felt something different. She wasn't dismissing his warnings or acting overconfident. Instead, she was listening carefully, asking thoughtful questions, and clearly taking the risks seriously. She also had something the other climbers hadn't, a lifetime of experience in these specific mountains. "The weather forecast shows a possible window tomorrow morning," Roberto said, checking his phone for the latest updates. "But these predictions change quickly up there. We might have clear skies when we start and find ourselves in a blizzard by afternoon." Maria nodded, understanding the implications. Mountain weather was notoriously unpredictable, and at high altitudes, storms could be deadly. But she had been watching these peaks her entire life. She knew how to read the subtle signs that the instruments might miss. The way the clouds formed, the direction of the wind, the color of the sky at different times of day. "I think tomorrow will be good," she said, surprising Roberto with her confidence. "The wind has been coming from the east for 3 days now, and I can see how the clouds are moving. We'll have clear weather until at least mid-afternoon." Roberto raised an eyebrow. He had learned to trust local weather instincts over the years, and Maria's prediction aligned with his own reading of the conditions. Maybe she did have a chance after all. That evening, as they prepared their equipment in the small mountain hut where they would spend the night, Maria reflected on the path that had brought her here. She thought about all the people who had doubted her abilities over the years, not out of malice, but out of concern and cultural expectations. Her parents had been worried when she first started climbing seriously. They feared for her safety and didn't understand why she couldn't be satisfied with a normal life in the village. Her friends thought she was taking unnecessary risks for no good reason. Even some of the male climbers she had met initially assumed she was just a tourist looking for an adventure rather than a serious mountaineer. But Maria had persisted. She had trained constantly, saving every peso to buy proper equipment. She had studied every available map and report about this mountain. She had spoken to every guide and climber who had attempted the route, learning from their mistakes and understanding where they had gone wrong. More importantly, she had never lost sight of why this climb mattered to her. It wasn't just about reaching the summit or proving something to the doubters. It was about honoring her connection to these mountains and showing that someone who truly understood them, who had grown up with them, could succeed where outsiders had failed. As she checked her gear one final time, Maria felt a deep sense of calm settle over her. Her ropes were in perfect condition, her anchors and carabiners had been tested and retested, and her emergency supplies were carefully organized and easily accessible. But beyond the technical preparation, she felt mentally and spiritually ready for the challenge ahead. The last rays of sunlight painted the peaks around them in shades of gold and pink. Maria stepped outside the hut and looked up at the mountain she would attempt to climb tomorrow. In the fading light, it looked both beautiful and intimidating, its steep faces and sharp ridges casting long shadows across the valley below. "Tomorrow we find out what you're really made of," she whispered to the mountain, as if it were an old friend rather than an adversary. Roberto joined her outside, following her gaze up toward the summit. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I've been guiding people on these mountains for 30 years, and I've learned to tell who has a real chance and who doesn't. Most people come here with big dreams and expensive gear, but they don't understand what it really takes." He paused, studying Maria's profile as she continued to look up at the mountain. "But you're different. You belong here. These mountains are part of who you are, and that might just be enough to make the difference." Maria smiled, feeling a surge of gratitude for Roberto's support. Having an experienced guide who believed in her abilities meant more than she could express. "Thank you for agreeing to help me attempt this," she said. "I know you could be guiding paying tourists instead." Roberto chuckled. "Those tourists will always be there, but the chance to be part of something truly special, to help someone who might actually succeed where so many others have failed, that doesn't come along very often. Besides, I'm curious to see if all my years of telling people they can't reach 3,800 meters might finally be proven wrong." As they prepared to go inside for the night, Maria took one last long look at the mountain. Tomorrow would bring challenges she couldn't fully anticipate, dangers that had turned back every previous attempt, and physical and mental tests that would push her to her absolute limits. But tonight, surrounded by the familiar sounds and smells of the mountains she had known all her life, Maria felt ready. She had prepared for this moment for years, and now it was finally time to discover whether all that preparation would be enough. Maria's journey, the ascent. The alarm buzzed at 3:30 a.m., cutting through the quiet mountain air like a knife. Maria was already awake, having slept fitfully through the night, her mind replaying every aspect of the climb ahead. She could hear Roberto moving around in the next room, quietly preparing his equipment and checking the weather conditions one final time. Outside, the world was still wrapped in darkness, but Maria could see the faint outline of stars through the small window. The absence of clouds was a good sign, confirming her prediction from the evening before. The weather window was holding, at least for now. They ate a simple breakfast of oatmeal, dried fruit, and strong coffee, consuming the calories they would need for the demanding day ahead. Neither spoke much, both lost in their own thoughts and mental preparations. Roberto had climbed this route many times, but never successfully to the summit. For Maria, this was uncharted territory beyond the 3,000-meter mark. By 4:45 a.m., they were checking their equipment one final time by. Maria's pack contained emergency shelter, first aid supplies, extra clothing layers, food, and water for an entire day. Every item had been carefully chosen for its weight and necessity. In high-altitude climbing, every gram mattered, but so did being prepared for emergencies. Roberto carried his own pack plus the rope system they would need for the technical sections higher up. His years of experience showed in how efficiently he organized everything, creating systems where each piece of gear was exactly where he needed it to be. "Remember," Roberto said as they prepared to leave the hut, "this mountain has defeated every previous attempt, but it's always been for different reasons. The German team had altitude problems, the American got caught by loose rock, and the Japanese were turned back by weather. Each group failed at the mountain's strongest point against their particular weakness." Maria nodded, understanding the lesson. The mountain wasn't just a physical challenge. It was a test that seemed to find each climber's vulnerable point and exploit it mercilessly. They began hiking by 5:15 a.m., using there to navigate the rocky trail that led to the base of the technical climbing sections. The path was familiar to Maria for the first few kilometers, following routes she had explored many times during her childhood adventures. But as they gained elevation, the terrain became more challenging and unfamiliar. The first section involved hiking up a steep but manageable trail through sparse vegetation and scattered boulders. Maria set a steady pace, drawing on her knowledge of how her body responded to altitude and exertion. She had learned through years of training that starting too fast would leave her exhausted later, while going too slowly might mean running out of daylight before reaching the summit. Roberto followed behind, watching Maria's movement and breathing carefully. As an experienced guide, he could tell a lot about a climber's condition and prospects by observing how they moved, especially in the early stages when energy was still high, but the body was beginning to adapt to increased altitude. By 7:00 a.m., they had reached 2,800 meters, and Maria could feel the familiar effects of altitude beginning to affect her. Her breathing was slightly faster, and she could sense her heart working harder to pump oxygen through her system. But these sensations were well within her comfort zone, familiar from countless training climbs at similar elevations. The sunrise painted the surrounding peaks in brilliant shades of orange and red, creating a spectacular backdrop for their climb. But Maria forced herself to focus on the route ahead rather than the scenery. Beautiful views could be distracting, and this mountain demanded complete attention. "The first technical section begins just ahead," Roberto called out, pointing to where the trail ended and the real climbing would begin. "This is where we rope up and start the challenging part." They paused to organize their gear and establish their climbing system. Roberto would lead each section, finding the route and setting anchors, while Maria would follow, cleaning the gear and preparing for her turn to lead when appropriate. This system would allow them to move efficiently while maintaining safety on the more dangerous sections. The rock was solid granite, worn smooth in places by centuries of wind and weather, but offering good holds for experienced climbers. Maria felt comfortable on this type of terrain, having practiced on similar rock formations near her village. Her movements were fluid and confident as she followed Roberto up the first technical pitch. By 9:00 a.m., they had reached 3,200 meters, the elevation where the German team had been forced to turn back due to altitude sickness. Maria paused to assess her own condition. She could definitely feel the effects of the thin air now. Every breath brought less oxygen than her body wanted, and her muscles were starting to work harder to maintain the same pace. But she felt strong and clear-headed. Her years of gradual acclimatization, living and training at elevation, were paying off. Where the German climbers had begun to struggle with headaches, nausea, and fatigue, Maria felt challenged but capable. "How are you feeling?" Roberto asked, studying her face for signs of altitude-related problems. "Good," Maria replied honestly. "Definitely feeling the elevation, but nothing I can't handle. My breathing is steady, no headache, and my energy levels are still solid." Roberto nodded approvingly. One of the most dangerous aspects of altitude sickness was that it could develop quickly and impair judgment. Climbers sometimes pushed too hard when they should have retreated, leading to serious medical emergencies. Maria's honest self-assessment and clear thinking were positive signs. The next section involved traversing across a steep face where loose rock made every step potentially dangerous. This was the area where the American climber had triggered a small rockfall that ended his attempt. Roberto led carefully, testing each handhold and foothold before committing his weight to it. "Watch this section carefully," he called back to Maria. "The rock looks solid, but some of these blocks are barely attached. Always test everything before you trust it." Maria followed his route exactly, understanding that deviating from the path he had tested could be catastrophic. She could see loose stones scattered below, evidence of rock falls from previous climbers who had been less careful. The American climber had been lucky to escape with only minor injuries when the rock gave way beneath him. They moved slowly and methodically across this dangerous section, taking almost 2 hours to cover what would normally be 20 minutes of climbing. But by 11:30 a.m., they had safely reached more solid rock at 3,400 meters, well beyond where most previous attempts had failed. Maria was beginning to feel the real challenge of high-altitude climbing now. The air was noticeably thinner, and each breath required conscious effort. Her movements were becoming more deliberate as her body worked harder to function with less available oxygen. But her mind remained clear, and her determination was stronger than ever. "This is where it gets interesting," Roberto said, pointing up at the route ahead. "The next 200 meters involve some of the most technical climbing on the entire mountain, and will be dealing with even thinner air. This is where technique and mental strength become more important than raw physical power." The rock face above them was nearly vertical, requiring careful attention to handholds and foot placement. At sea level, this type of climbing would be challenging but manageable for someone of Maria's skill level. But at 3,400 meters, with significantly less oxygen available, every move required extra effort and concentration. Roberto began leading the first technical pitch, moving slowly and deliberately up the steep rock. Maria watched his technique carefully, learning from his movements and planning her own sequence up the wall. She could see that he was working harder now too, pausing more frequently to catch his breath and carefully considering each move before committing to it. When it was her turn to climb, Maria felt the full impact of the altitude for the first time. Moves that would have been routine at lower elevation now left her breathing hard and needing to rest. Her forearms burned from gripping the rock, and her legs felt heavy and sluggish. But she also felt something else, a deep satisfaction at being able to perform technically difficult climbing at an elevation that had defeated so many others. Each successful move up the rock face felt like a small victory, proof that her years of preparation and her intimate knowledge of these mountains were making the crucial difference. By 1:00 p.m., they had reached 3,600 meters, the highest point achieved by the American climber before his retreat due to the rockfall. Maria paused to look around, realizing she was now higher on this mountain than anyone had ever been before. The view was spectacular, with other peaks stretching endlessly in every direction, but she forced herself to focus on the immediate challenges. The weather was still holding, with clear skies and minimal wind. Maria's weather prediction had proven accurate so far, giving them the stable conditions they needed for the most technical sections of the climb. But she knew that mountain weather could change rapidly, and they still had 200 vertical meters to go. Roberto was showing signs of fatigue now, breathing harder and moving more slowly than he had earlier in the day. This was his highest elevation on this particular route as well, and even his extensive experience couldn't completely offset the challenges of extreme altitude. "How much further to the summit?" Maria asked, though she had studied the route maps extensively and already knew the answer. "About 200 meters vertical, maybe 400 meters of actual climbing distance," Roberto replied. "But it's going to be the hardest 200 meters. The rock gets more technical, and we're entering the zone where the Japanese expedition was turned back by sudden weather." As if summoned by his words, Maria noticed the first signs of clouds beginning to form around some of the higher peaks in the distance. The weather window that had given them perfect conditions all morning might be starting to close. They would need to move faster if they wanted to reach the summit and return safely. But moving faster at this altitude was easier said than done. Every breath was precious, every movement required careful consideration, and rushing could lead to mistakes that would be catastrophic at this elevation and exposure. Maria looked up at the final sections of the climb, then back at Roberto. She could see the uncertainty in his eyes. They were in uncharted territory now, higher than any previous attempt had reached, with weather potentially developing and their bodies pushed to their limits by the extreme altitude. This was the moment when she would discover whether all her preparation, all her natural advantages, and all her determination would be enough to accomplish what everyone said was impossible: Maria's journey, the summit. The clouds Roberto had spotted were growing larger and darker, moving toward their mountain with the ominous inevitability that had defeated the Japanese expedition. Maria studied the approaching weather system with the eye of someone who had spent her entire life reading these mountain signals. She estimated they had perhaps 2 hours before the storms would reach them, maybe 3 if they were lucky. At 3,600 meters, with 200 vertical meters still to climb, that timeline would be cutting it dangerously close. But Maria felt something stirring inside her that she had never experienced before on any climb. It wasn't just determination or stubbornness. It was a deep knowing that this mountain, these peaks that had shaped her entire life, were finally ready to let her reach the top. "Roberto," she said, her voice carrying a confidence that surprised even her, "I think we can make it, but I need to lead from here." Roberto looked at her with surprise. Throughout the climb, he had been the leader, setting the route and pace. It was the traditional arrangement between guide and client, and his experience had been invaluable in getting them safely to this point. But Maria's request made sense on several levels. She was feeling stronger than he was at this extreme altitude. Her years of acclimatization were showing their value now, when oxygen was most precious. More importantly, she had an intuitive understanding of these particular mountains that came from a lifetime of observation and connection. If anyone could find the route through the final technical sections, it would be someone who truly belonged here. "Are you sure?" Roberto asked, studying her face carefully. At this altitude and exposure, leadership decisions could mean the difference between success and disaster. "The route ahead is completely unknown. We'll be navigating by instinct and basic mountaineering principles." "I'm sure," Maria replied, already beginning to reorganize her gear for leading. "These mountains have been teaching me my whole life. I think they've been preparing me for exactly this moment." Roberto nodded and began preparing to follow rather than lead. Despite his decades of experience, he recognized that Maria had something special in this environment. Her movements had remained fluid and confident while his own were becoming labored and careful. Her breathing was steady while his required conscious effort. Most importantly, she radiated a sense of belonging on this mountain that no outside climber could ever achieve. Maria took the lead rope and began studying the rock face above them. The route was steep and complex, requiring a combination of technical climbing skills and route-finding ability. There were several possible paths upward, but only one would provide the right combination of safety, efficiency, and progress toward the summit. As she began climbing, Maria felt herself entering a state she had only experienced a few times before in her life. Her movements became instinctive rather than calculated. Her hands seemed to find holds without conscious searching. Her feet found purchase on tiny ledges and crystals in the rock that she somehow knew would support her weight. Roberto followed behind, watching in amazement as Maria navigated through technical sections that would have challenged professional climbers at sea level. At 3,700 meters, with air so thin that every breath was an effort, she was climbing with the grace and efficiency of someone on their local practice crag. "This is incredible," Roberto called up to her during a brief rest at a small ledge. You're climbing better now than you were at 2,000 meters this morning. How is that possible? Maria paused to consider his question. She was feeling something she had never experienced before. Instead of being worn down by the extreme altitude, she felt energized by being so high on this mountain. It was as if the closer she got to the summit, the stronger her connection to the mountain became. I think these mountains are helping me, she said, knowing how that might sound to someone who didn't share her background. I know that sounds crazy, but I feel like they want me to succeed. Roberto didn't think it sounded crazy at all. In 30 years of guiding in these mountains, he had learned to respect the indigenous understanding of these peaks as living entities with their own personalities and preferences. If any mountain was going to choose someone to succeed where so many others had failed, it would make sense for it to be someone who belonged here rather than another passing visitor. By 2:30 p.m., they had reached 3,750 meters, higher than the Japanese expedition's high point. The approaching weather system was definitely getting closer, but Maria's weather prediction was holding true. They still had time, though probably not much margin for error. The final 50 meters to the summit involved some of the most challenging climbing of the entire route. The rock was steep, and the holds were small, requiring precise technique and total focus. At this altitude, even experienced climbers would normally be moving slowly and carefully, taking frequent rests and double-checking every decision. But Maria was climbing with increasing confidence and speed. Her body had somehow adapted to the extreme altitude in ways that normal expectations. Her breathing, while still labored, had found a sustainable rhythm. Her strength, instead of fatting, seemed to be drawing from sources she had never accessed before. The summit is just above us, she called down to Roberto. I can see the top. Roberto felt a surge of excitement mixed with disbelief. After 30 years of telling climbers they couldn't reach 3,800 meters on this mountain, he was about to witness someone actually do it. And not just anyone, but a local woman who had grown up in the shadow of these peaks and understood them in ways no outsider ever could. The final moves to the summit were a steep scramble over large granite blocks, requiring more scrambling technique than technical climbing skills. Maria moved upward with steady determination, checking each hold carefully, but never hesitating once she committed to a move. At 3:15 p.m., Maria's head appeared above the final rock wall, and she looked around at a sight no human being had ever seen before from this exact perspective. The summit of the mountain was a small, flat area just large enough for two people, surrounded by spectacular views in every direction. She pulled herself up onto the summit platform and sat down for a moment, overwhelmed by what she had just accomplished. Behind her, Roberto was climbing the final moves, his face showing a mixture of exhaustion and triumph that matched her own feelings. "We did it," Roberto said as he joined her on the summit. "You did it, 3,800 meters. After all these years of telling people it was impossible, you proved me wrong." Maria looked around at the incredible panorama of peaks stretching endlessly in every direction. She could see the village where she had grown up, tiny and distant far below. She could see other mountains where she had trained and practiced, preparing for this moment. She could see weather systems moving through distant valleys, confirming her prediction that they had chosen the perfect day for this attempt. But more than the physical views, Maria felt a profound sense of completion and belonging. This mountain had tested her in every way possible, physically, technically, mentally, and spiritually. It had challenged her skills, her preparation, her determination, and her understanding of these peaks that had shaped her entire life. And she had passed every test, not through superior equipment or extensive support teams, but through intimate knowledge, careful preparation, and a deep connection to the mountain environment that had been her home since birth. "Take a picture," Roberto said, pulling out his camera. "People need to see this. They need to know that someone finally reached 3,800 meters on this mountain." Maria posed for several photos, holding a small flag she had brought to mark the successful summit. But even as they documented the achievement, she was aware of the approaching weather and the need to begin their descent soon. "We should start down," she said, looking at the clouds that were definitely getting closer. "We've accomplished what we came here to do, but we still need to get back safely." Roberto nodded, understanding that successful mountaineering was as much about smart descents as challenging ascents. They had proven what they set out to prove. but their safety depended on getting back to lower elevation before the weather deteriorated. As they prepared to leave the summit, Maria took one final look around at the incredible views from 3,800 meters. She thought about all the people who had doubted this was possible, including Roberto himself, until just hours ago. She thought about the failed expeditions that had turned back at various points along this same route. Most of all, she thought about what this success meant for her own understanding of her capabilities and her relationship with these mountains. She had always felt connected to these peaks, but now she knew that connection went both ways. The mountains had tested her, but they had also supported her and ultimately allowed her to succeed where so many others had failed. The descent would require the same careful attention and technical skill that had gotten them to the summit. But as they began rappelling down the steep rock faces, Maria felt confident that they would return safely to share the story of their success. At 6:45 p.m., as the first snow flakes from the approaching storm began to fall, Maria and Roberto walked back into the mountain hut where their journey had begun that morning. They were exhausted, dehydrated, and physically drained from 12 hours of extreme climbing. But they were also triumphant. "I need to call the climbing shop and tell Carlos what happened," Maria said, pulling out her phone to get a signal. "He's not going to believe it." Roberto sat down heavily in a chair, still processing what they had accomplished. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I've been telling people for 30 years that you can't hit 3,800 meters on this mountain. I was wrong, but I was only wrong about one thing." "What's that?" Maria asked. "I was wrong about who could do it," Roberto replied. "Outsiders can't reach 3,800 meters on this mountain, but someone who belongs here, someone who understands these peaks the way you do, someone who has been preparing their entire life without even knowing it, that person can do anything." Maria smiled, feeling a deep satisfaction that went far beyond the physical accomplishment of reaching the summit. She had not only proven that 3,800 meters was possible, but she had done it in a way that honored her connection to these mountains and showed that local knowledge and deep understanding could succeed where expensive expeditions and foreign expertise had failed. As the storm settled in outside the hut, Maria and Roberto shared a simple dinner and planned how they would share their story with the world. The mountain that had defeated every previous attempt had finally found someone worthy of its summit, and that someone had been there all along, growing up in its shadow and learning its secrets.